On December 14, 2025, in a story imagined, not reported, a 911 call breaks the calm of a quiet Brentwood night. When paramedics arrive, they find a house untouched by force and filled with an impossible silence. Inside are two lives that ended where they once felt safest. The name attached to this hypothetical tragedy is Rob Reiner, one of Hollywood's most beloved storytellers, and the questions begin immediately. If there's no sign of an intruder, where do investigators look next? And what happens when the search for answers turns inward toward the people closest to the truth? This isn't a tale about headlines. It's a thought experiment about legacy, family, and the fragile line between the stories we tell and the lives we live. Before we confront the ending, we have to understand the man. What he built, what he carried, and the shadow he spent a lifetime trying to outrun. Because sometimes, the most chilling mysteries don't start with violence. They start with love and what it fails to protect. December 14th, 2025. The weekend should have been filled with holiday cheer. Saturday night, December 13th, Hollywood's elite gathered at Conan O'Brien's Los Angeles home for his annual Christmas party. Among the guests were Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner, married for 35 years, still partners in life and work. Their son Nick, 32, was also there. But something went wrong that night. According to witnesses, Nick's behavior was disruptive. He made guests uncomfortable. At some point during the evening, he got into a heated argument with his father. The nature of that argument remains unclear, but those who saw it described tension that seemed to spill beyond the bounds of a typical family disagreement. Rob and Michelle, sources later revealed, had expressed worries about their son's health and state of mind. The party ended. The family went home, and less than 24 hours later, everything would be irreversibly shattered. 3:30 p.m., Sunday afternoon. The Los Angeles Fire Department received a call requesting medical assistance at a residence in Brentwood, one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods, where gated homes sit behind walls and hedges, promising privacy and security. When paramedics arrived at the multi-million-dollar mansion, they found something no amount of wealth could protect against. Inside the primary bedroom, Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle Singer Reiner, 68, were deceased. Multiple stab wounds. Their throats had been slit. No signs of forced entry. No evidence suggesting the hurried arrival or departure of an intruder. Just an enclosed space where two people had died violently, and where all the doors had remained locked from the inside. It was their daughter, Romy, who discovered them. She had gone to the house and found her parents in a scene no child should ever witness. The house that had been filled with laughter, with the sounds of filmmaking conversations and family dinners, was now silent except for the arrival of emergency responders. By late afternoon, police cordoned off several blocks around the house. News helicopters circled overhead. Neighbors emerged onto their lawns, stunned. Billy Crystal and Larry David, close friends of Rob for decades, were spotted near the scene, their faces drawn with grief and disbelief. The investigation turns inward. Deputy Police Chief Alan Hamilton held a press conference around 8:50 p.m. that evening. His words were measured, careful. He would not confirm the identities of the victims. That would come from the coroner's office. He would not discuss a cause of death. He would only say that a death investigation was underway and would continue through the night. But behind the scenes, Detectives from the LAPD's Robbery Homicide Division were already following a trail that led in one direction. The absence of external suspects, the locked doors, the personal nature of the attack, and the family's long, painful, and very public history with addiction and mental health struggles. At approximately 9:15 p.m., less than 6 hours after the bodies were discovered, Nick Reiner was located near the University of Southern California campus and taken into custody. He was arrested on suspicion of murder and booked by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department in the early morning hours of Monday, December 15th. Bail was set at $4 million. Later, he would be held without bail. On Monday afternoon, the LAPD released a statement that removed any ambiguity. The investigation further revealed that Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son of Robert and Michelle Reiner, was responsible for their deaths. By Tuesday, December 16th, the case was presented to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. District Attorney Nathan J. Hochman announced that Nick Reiner would be charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. If convicted, he could face the death penalty. The silence that followed, the Reiner family released only a brief statement through their representative. It is with profound sorrow that we announce the tragic passing of Michelle and Rob Reiner. We are heartbroken by this sudden loss, and we ask for privacy during this unbelievably difficult time. No details, no explanations, no defense of Nick. Just a request for silence from a family that had already lived through years of private suffering that occasionally spilled into public view. Tracy Reiner, Rob's adopted daughter from his marriage to Penny Marshall, broke her silence with a heartbreaking post. I came from the greatest family ever. I don't know what to say. I'm in shock. Hollywood, meanwhile, struggled to process the loss. Not just the deaths of 2 beloved figures, but the nature of those deaths. That they occurred at the hands of their own son. That a family which had shared their struggles so openly, through interviews, through a semi-autobiographical film, had not been able to prevent this ending. The question that hung over everything was simple and impossible. How did it come to this? To understand that, we have to go back. Back to the shadow Rob was born into. The career he built against all expectations, the son who struggled under the weight of the Reiner name, and the Saturday night argument at a Christmas party that may have been the final spark in a tragedy, decades in the making. The shadow he was born into, Rob Reiner, was born in 1947, and from the moment he entered the world, he was already someone's son before he was ever himself. His father was Carl Reiner, one of the founding architects of American comedy, The Dick Van Dyke Show, collaborations with Mel Brooks, a body of work that didn't just entertain millions, but shaped the very DNA of what American humor would become for generations. Carl Reiner wasn't just famous, he was beloved. He was the kind of figure people didn't criticize because criticizing him felt like criticizing laughter itself. Growing up in that household, Rob didn't lack anything material. He had access, opportunity, connections, and a front-row seat to the machinery of show business. But he also had something else, a name that arrived in every room before he did. A standard that he didn't set, but was constantly measured against. Every success invited the question of whether it was earned or inherited. Every failure, no matter how small, was magnified because people expected the son of a legend to be exceptional by default. Rob later admitted that his entire youth felt like walking through a house where all the furniture had already been arranged. He could move around, but he couldn't rearrange anything. He could succeed, but only in ways that didn't disturb the existing order. The tragedy wasn't deprivation. The tragedy was the constant need to prove worthiness in a space that had already decided what worthiness looked like. He once said in an interview, "People didn't see me. They saw a continuation. And I spent years trying to figure out if there was a version of me that existed outside of that. That search would define everything that came next." The actor who wanted more. In the late 1960s, Rob Reiner entered acting, and by 1971, he landed a role that would make him a household name. Mike "Meathead" Stivic in All in the Family. The show was groundbreaking. It tackled race, politics, class, and generational conflict at a time when most sitcoms were still pretending those things didn't exist. Rob's character was the liberal son-in-law, constantly clashing with Archie Bunker, and audiences loved him. He was smart, passionate, and represented a younger generation that wasn't afraid to challenge old values. The show ran until 1979, and during that time, Rob became one of the most recognized faces on American television. But recognition came with a cost. In the eyes of 1970s Hollywood, he was a sitcom actor. Talented, yes. Likeable, absolutely. But not someone who was expected to do anything beyond what he was already doing. When he started telling people toward the end of the decade that he wanted to become a director, the response was polite laughter, not cruelty, just disbelief. The industry had already decided what box he belonged in, and stepping outside that box wasn't part of the plan. Rob later said that this period taught him a bitter truth. Being liked is not the same as being trusted. People enjoyed watching him on screen, but they didn't believe he could stand behind the camera and create something of his own. The same name that had opened doors as a child was now closing them as an adult. He was still Carl Reiner's son. He was still Meathead. And neither of those identities left room for the person he was trying to become. But Rob didn't take the safe turn. He didn't retreat into what was comfortable. He walked straight into the place where he wasn't expected and decided to let the work speak for itself. The director who proved them wrong. In 1984, This Is Spinal Tap was released. At first glance, it looked like a clever joke. A mockumentary about a fictional rock band poking fun at the excesses and absurdities of the music industry. But the more people watched, the clearer it became that Rob Reiner wasn't just making people laugh. He was dissecting an entire culture that took itself far too seriously. And he was doing it without raising his voice, without making grand declarations. He simply placed the camera in the right spot and let the absurdity reveal itself. The film became a cult classic. It proved that Rob Reiner had a directorial voice that was entirely his own. And then he did something even more remarkable. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't become the mockumentary guy. He moved in a completely different direction. In 1986, Stand By Me was released, a coming-of-age story about 4 boys searching for a dead body in the Oregon wilderness. On paper, it sounds morbid. On screen, it became one of the most emotionally honest portrayals of childhood friendship ever filmed. The film didn't try to be grand. It simply told the truth about what it feels like to be young, afraid, and desperate for connection. Roger Ebert called it one of the year's best films. Audiences didn't just watch it, they felt it. And suddenly, Rob Reiner was no longer Carl Reiner's son or the guy from All in the Family. He was a director who understood something about human beings that most filmmakers spent their entire careers trying to grasp. Then came The Princess Bride in 1987, a fairy tale that somehow managed to be both sincere and self-aware, romantic and funny, timeless and completely of its moment. It didn't perform spectacularly at the box office, but it became one of those rare films that people passed down to their children, that got quoted at weddings, that entered the cultural vocabulary in a way that transcends any single generation. Then, When Harry Met Sally in 1989, a romantic comedy that treated its characters like actual adults, that acknowledged the messiness of love without cynicism, that gave the world one of the most iconic scenes in film history. Then Misery in 1990, a psychological thriller that proved he could work in any genre. Then A Few Good Men in 1992, a courtroom drama that delivered one of the most quoted lines in American cinema: "You can't handle the truth." In less than a decade, Rob Reiner went from being doubted to being undeniable. His films didn't look alike. They didn't feel alike. But they all shared something that was difficult to name: a sense that the people on screen were not written to be grand or impressive, but to feel real. Children who were stubborn and fragile. Adults who loved, feared, hesitated, and were often unsure whether they were doing the right thing. Hollywood stopped asking whose son he was. They started asking what he was going to make next. The slow fade. But Hollywood rarely holds space for anyone forever. By the late 1990s, something began to shift. A new generation of filmmakers emerged. Cinematic rhythms changed. Audience tastes evolved. And Rob Reiner's later projects no longer commanded the same attention. There was no dramatic downfall, no scandal, no public collapse that could be easily named. There were simply fewer invitations, phone calls that no longer came first, the quiet realization that he was no longer the name a room waited for before making a decision. Some films were still made. They were still careful, still bearing his familiar touch. But they passed through theaters more quietly. People didn't argue about them. They didn't hate them. They just didn't notice them the way they once had. It was a very particular kind of Hollywood silence, the kind where things don't end with a door slamming shut, but with the door no longer being held open. Rob later admitted that nothing collapsed. It just grew quiet, and somehow, he found himself standing outside a room he once belonged to. The lights were still on, but they were no longer shining in his direction. For someone who had spent his entire life trying to prove he belonged, that silence was its own kind of wound. Not loud enough to demand attention, just persistent enough to never fully heal. And then, while his professional life was fading into quiet, something far more painful was happening at home. The son he couldn't save. Nick Reiner was born in 1993, the second son of Rob and Michelle. And from early on, something was different. While his older brother followed a more conventional path, Nick drifted. By the age of 15, he was struggling with addiction. The years that followed were not a straight line. They were a cycle. Rehabilitation followed by relapse. Periods of stability followed by collapse. There were times when Nick didn't have a fixed place to live. Times when he drifted across multiple states. Times when he fell into homelessness, a reality completely at odds with the public image of the Reiner family. Nick didn't hide his struggles. In the rare moments when he spoke publicly, he talked about feeling lost, about being unable to find a place for himself in a world where the name Reiner was both a privilege and a burden. The same shadow that had haunted Rob as a young man had now fallen on his son. Only this time, the weight expressed itself not through professional doubt, but through something far more destructive. In 2016, Nick publicly shared his story for the first time in an interview. He didn't defend himself. He simply admitted what had happened. He talked about addiction, about relapses, and about the greatest pain not being his own suffering, but the harm he had caused his parents over many years. Rob Reiner didn't stand outside that story. He stood beside his son, not as a director, but as a father who understood that there are battles you cannot fight on your child's behalf. No matter how much you love them, no matter how desperately you want to. From that experience, Rob directed a film called Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical story inspired directly by Nick's journey. The film doesn't try to provide answers. It doesn't attempt to neatly resolve the problem. It simply tells the story of an addicted teenager, of a family's helplessness, and of a love that is not strong enough to save. It was not a healing work. It was a confession placed on the screen. A father's way of saying, this is what we lived through. This is what we couldn't fix. For Rob and Michelle, Nick's struggle had no clear climax, no definitive ending. It was simply years spent in a state of waiting, waiting for their son to improve, waiting for him to stand a little longer than the last time, waiting for a breakthrough that kept slipping away, a form of quiet suffering, prolonged, ongoing, without an easy name. The final loss before the end. In 2020, Rob Reiner passed away at the age of 98. To the world, it was the complete closing of a legend. But to Rob, it was something far more personal. It was the first time he lost the person who had always stood behind him, the one who shielded him, guided him, and remained there throughout his life. Sometimes as a shadow, sometimes as an anchor, always as the person who made him feel that he no longer had to prove anything. After the funeral, Rob admitted that he truly felt orphaned, even though he was already in his 70s. Not because he lacked care, but because the one person who made him feel that his worth was already settled was gone. When that person left, he was forced to stand alone far later in life than most people ever have to. In the years that followed, Rob Reiner continued to appear in public. He became one of the most vocal critics of the political direction America was taking. He didn't hide his stance. He didn't speak in half measures. For some, that bluntness was courage. For others, it became a dividing line. Rob Reiner was no longer seen primarily as a storyteller-director, but as a voice associated with contemporary political debate. In an increasingly polarized society, that association came with a cost, not professionally devastating, but quietly distancing. The films were still there, but the man who made them was no longer listened to in the same way by everyone who once loved his work. And through all of it, the worry about Nick never stopped. The cycle of hope and disappointment never ended. The fear that one day he would receive a phone call with news no parent should ever have to hear. Rob Reiner carried that weight into every room, even when no one else could see it. What he left behind. Within hours of the news breaking, tributes began to pour in. Barack Obama remembered Rob Reiner as a storyteller who helped America look back at itself, not through slogans, but through deeply human stories. He wrote that Rob understood America in a way that only those who truly love it can. Nancy Pelosi spoke of him as an artist who never separated cinema from civic responsibility. Within the filmmaking community, the grief arrived more quietly. Aaron Sorkin recalled working with Reiner on A Few Good Men. Rob taught me that drama isn't in the smartest line of dialogue, but in the moment when someone stops just before speaking. Billy Crystal wrote simply, "He never pushed you as an actor. He made you want to be better just by standing there and believing in you." Meg Ryan shared that working with Rob felt safe, something rare on a film set. When people speak about Rob Reiner now, they don't talk about box office numbers or awards. They remember him through small details. The way he stood behind the camera. The way he lowered his voice to tell an actor to deliver a line as if they were speaking the truth. The way he stepped back just enough to let the story speak for itself. Throughout his career, Rob Reiner told stories about imperfect families, about people who love each other yet are powerless to save each other, about the distance that grows between parents and children even when no one intends for it to happen. He didn't tell those stories because they were compelling themes. He told them because they were something he had lived with all his life, first as a son, then as a father. And in the end, his own private life quietly followed that same frame. A father who loved his son, a son who couldn't escape his demons, and a tragedy that no amount of success, no amount of awards, no amount of cultural legacy could prevent. The investigation remains open. The truth remains behind closed doors. Until it concludes, we cannot know exactly what happened inside that Brentwood house on December 14th. But one thing is already clear. Rob Reiner did not leave as a symbol. He left as a human being, a man who spent his entire life trying to step out of shadows, only to have the final chapter of his story disappear into one he never could have scripted. The films remain. Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, and Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men. They will continue to be watched, quoted, and passed down. But the man who made them is gone, and the silence that follows is heavier than any farewell. If this story lingered with you, let it. Because the films we love don't end when the credits roll. They follow us. They shape how we see family, loyalty, and the quiet fractures no camera ever captures. Rob Reiner spent a lifetime telling stories about people bound together by love, yet undone by what they couldn't say out loud. And when the lights went out, the contrast between the legend and the man became impossible to ignore. This chapter may be closing, but the questions it raises are only beginning. In a world that celebrates the finished film and ignores the cost of making it, how many truths remain hidden behind familiar names? And when the story turns inward, toward family, toward legacy, are we ever really prepared for what we might find next?